Good morning. It's as Jacob said, I don't have very many German words, so I think I understand enough to order dinner, but that's about it. So unless we're going to order dinner today, I'm going to be presenting in English. As he was saying, I am an independent analyst and a consultant working in BPM. So I have been working with what you would call BPM, originally workflow things, since probably the mid to late 80s. I was a very young child at the time, obviously, but working, first as a developer and then more as an architect and designer. And now I did spend a period of time working for one of the larger BPM vendors. I worked for FileNet in 2000 and 2001. That was long before their acquisition by IBM. And worked as kind of an evangelist, where I went out and talked with companies about how what was then very emerging model-driven BPM and BPM in general, and how this could impact their business. So after that, I really returned just to independent consulting. Prior to that, I had built a product company and a services company, but I figured I just wanted to kind of take a break and just do a little consulting instead. So now I spend about 3/4 of my time helping end customer organizations, so enterprise customers, mostly financial services, with doing BPM implementations. So they may need to select a vendor, they may need to decide on their architecture, their technical architecture, their business architecture, they might need help with process modeling, and I've done kind of all those bits and pieces so I can kind of help them out with things. And I was joking yesterday, I don't write code anymore because I'm too old and expensive for that, but if they really needed me to, I could probably pull out a textbook and figure out how to write something or other. But one of the things that we've been talking about this year, and this really came up at a conference in March in Monterey, California, called BPM Next, and Jacob was there speaking about this idea of the zero code myth, but there were a number of other people gave talks kind of on the same idea of zero code BPM. And because I have a long historical perspective on BPM, I see that we go through these different cycles and these different, the flavor of the month, we would call it. So what's popular today, what's not popular, and the idea of zero code has become very popular, but in many cases it is just that. It's an idea or it's a myth. It's not something that we can actually implement in reality as we look at adding BPM or implementing BPM for our complex core systems that we have. And there are cases where it is kind of more appropriate, but I want to go through a little bit of a historical perspective and look at some of that. I do have a blog, column2.com. You can take a look at that. The blogging is the stuff that I actually do for fun, believe it or not. So I was blogging yesterday from the community day. I did a couple of posts about some of the things that I saw there and heard there because they were in English, so I could understand what was going on. And you can follow me on Twitter. I was tweeting a little bit yesterday and today as well. So I wanted to look, first of all, at how we got to where we are, because we're at a point in BPM where there's a lot of, not necessarily confusion in the marketplace, but I think we're at a point where we've had very different types of systems come together under a common umbrella, all called BPM, and now I think we're seeing a little bit of a split again with systems. So we're starting to see some interesting things, and some of that we can take a look at the historical perspective to get a better idea of it. I do want to take a look at the idea of model-driven BPM, how we got to this zero-code idea where everybody's really gung-ho on that, and the salespeople come out and tell you, like, oh, you just buy this big thing and you'll never write code again because you just draw your process and then everything happens magically from there, as we know that's not actually how it works in most cases. And then looking at this idea of more of the developer-friendly BPM system, so where we're adding process to our code rather than coding in our BPM systems. And then finishing up with just some of the paradigms and why you might pick one or the other. So I'm not saying that there's only room in the marketplace for one or the other type of system. It's just that we have to understand the paradigms as developers and designers of systems and implementers of systems. We have to understand these paradigms and understand why one is better than the other in certain situations. But remember as well that this is software, so really you can do anything with anything. It's just a matter of how well suited any particular system or tool is for a given job. So just looking at a bit of a history then, we started out before 1980, and in fact still a lot today. We have process embedded within our core enterprise applications. So if you work, for example, for a bank, you would have banking systems that are probably like older than most of the people here, and they have processes embedded within them. So people who work with those systems are using just, there's procedural code in there that goes through and implements a business process from one step to another. They're not flexible, they're not externalized, there's lots of reasons we don't want to have our processes in there, but that's how it used to be done in the bad old days. And then as we started to get into the 1980s, we had workflow systems mostly built around some of the document imaging systems that we had. So this is when we saw products like FileNet and IBM Image Plus and these types of things emerge, older ones that kind of went away after a while. But this really managed the human and paper flows, because so much of our business then was driven by paper documents coming in the door. So we needed to be able to take that paper out of the system as quickly as possible so that we could move those documents around and have people look at them and do work with them. We also had at the same time, and in that same time frame, we started to get messaging for system-to-system flows. So for the non-human flows, we saw things like IBM MQ series and the predecessors to that, and some of the TIBCO technology was starting to emerge then, where it was, again, flows, again, processes, but they were going from one computer to another, not from one person to another, so there were no people involved. And these were two very different types of what eventually both became called BPM systems, but they had very different purposes to them. Now, as we started to get into the 1990s, first of all, we saw some of the emergence at the end of the decade into the model-driven BPM. So I probably saw the first things in like the very late 90s, 1998, 99, 2000, where you could now draw a process model and it became an executable process. You still had to write code for all of the other things. You had to develop all your user interface, you had to do all your integration in code, everything was done in code, except the process model itself could be done as a model, and then became executable, and then it had entry points where you could tag into that with your code. At the same time, during the latter half of the 90s, we saw the human and the automated systems come together. And a lot of this was because of a Gartner report that came out, I think in 99 or 2000, where they defined the business process management system space. And they lumped everything that had anything to do with process under that same category. So all of a sudden you had all of these tools, many of which were really just system-centric tools for doing system-to-system messaging, and then these very human-centric, managing tasks, human tasks, and they were all considered the same category of product. So this was obviously very confusing for all of the people who were buying systems and using systems at the time. It was great for the vendors because it gave them a chance to go in and sell into markets that hadn't been available to them before because they were considered under that category. And then we started to see a lot of growth of the vendors towards each other in that space. So you still have today systems, although they tend to be much more in the middle, you still see some that tend to be more on the human-centric side and some that tend to be more on the system-centric side, but they always have capabilities that overlap to a certain extent. And that was really what we were seeing by the end of the 90s. Now, as we got into the 2000s, or the noughties as they call them sometimes, we started out now with the idea more of zero-code BPMS. So we have a model-driven, certainly for the process model, we have a model-driven system, but now we were starting to see zero code for other things, such as some very simple user interfaces. So we would be able to have a forms interface that was directly designed within the BPM system. So now our BPM system is becoming more like an application development environment, which is a little bit strange. So now instead of writing code for a simple application that only has process and some human-facing forms, you could actually do that completely within the context of your BPM system. And so because that wasn't considered to be code, it was now, let's give this to the business analysts and let them do it. They can just write their own systems. And this, of course, there's a lot of problems with that, and I'm going to talk about a few of the problems with that, but that was where that idea started, is that if we don't have a 3GL type code, a language that we're writing, if it's done graphically, then it's no longer code. And this, of course, is a flawed idea. If you can't just say it's not code because it's a graphical development environment, because as you know, we've all worked with graphical development environments for years, and they're still development. They're still code, they're just represented with a graphical syntax. But this is where the idea came from. And this is also during this time period where we started to see this integration of all these other technologies into our BPM systems. So it wasn't enough that our BPM systems just did process. They had to do a lot of other things as well. They had to have rules in there. They had to have integration in there. So this is where we started to see things where you could do web service calls directly out of your processes as a built-in kind of step, or where you could build business rules in there. They had to have more capable user interface development capabilities rather than just simple forms. So we started to see the ability to create portals and so on. So a lot of different things that we think of as being application development tools or capabilities were now seen as being a part of what should be in a BPM system. And then as we started to get into the what came out a couple of years ago was a new Gartner a magic quadrant, and it was, I was going to say the magic wave, I'm confusing the Forrester and the Gartner terminology, but the magic quadrant on what they call intelligent BPMS. And in this, in order to be considered an intelligent BPM system, then the vendor had to have all of these capabilities. So it wasn't just BPM anymore. It was now content and process and rules and integration and analytics and all of these other things all had to be combined into this same system, quite tightly integrated into this system. So now instead of picking best of breed for the different tools you might need, we're really now looking at more of a monolithic, full application development environment. And that was in part Gartner recognizing what was happening in the marketplace, but also they're large enough and influential enough that they can help to make the marketplace as well, so that the vendors became adding on more and more information in there and more capabilities in there. So now what we see in the last couple of years is that many BPM systems have emerged as these monolithic replacements for our application development environments. And this is not necessarily a good thing. What I find in many cases when I'm working with my enterprise clients, when I go in and I talk to a bank or an insurance company, they don't want to refactor all of their existing code that they've written in Java or whatever other language they're using. They don't want to be rewriting all of that in a BPM system as a full application development environment. If they were doing greenfield development, if there was nothing there already, then that would be a different story. Then they could actually consider it. But that's not where they're at, and that's not where most organizations are at. There's already something in place, and they need to be able to add process management capabilities onto that, rather than think about rewriting it as a BPM application. So maybe that wasn't quite a brief history of BPMS, but you kind of get the idea. So the problems that we had, okay, here we go. So the model-driven development, before we had model-driven development, or maybe I should say without model-driven development, what we had, and this is the sort of classic life cycle, software development life cycle that I'm sure those of you who are my age, or maybe not too much younger than my age, probably remember this fairly well. So we would have a business analyst who would write requirements. So they would go out and talk to everybody in the business. They would write, big Word documents. They might do some diagrams in Visio, or you're not going to believe this, but I have one client who does all their diagrams in PowerPoint, which seems like the oddest place to do process diagrams. But anyway, so they would do all these diagrams and these written descriptions of what had to be in the system. I'm sure none of you use PowerPoint for your process modeling, right? But, yeah, right. So they would go out and get all these requirements. The process diagrams would then be an illustration. They would take all of this and pass it off to the development group. And the development group, in a lot of cases, what we see now is this is still being done very waterfall methodology, and it's being passed to an offshore development group because and this is part of why they think they have to write these requirements, is that they need to have a very long descriptive requirement that sort of tells them everything so that they can pass it off to an external or outsourced development team. Now, what happens on the developer side is that they get these requirements, and they interpret them. And sometimes they're a little bit, creative about how they interpret them, so that what gets implemented isn't actually what's in the requirements, because the developer thinks, well, that's not really what they need. And sometimes it isn't really what they need, but sometimes it is what they need. So then you get into this whole thing of developing something that's not what was asked for, but might be better for them or might not be better for them. So we then have the developer take this, interpret it in some way, and then possibly write some additional specifications or design, and then write the code. So this is how we used to write code. So for you youngsters, this is how it happened back in the old days. The problems that we had with that is that there was no real way to align the requirements that the business analysts, or that as representatives of the business, that the requirements that they wrote with all of these process diagrams and technical specifications and so on. So we didn't have anything that was written by an analyst on the business side that would actually become part of the executable code. So we didn't have that linkage there. We were relying on the people, the business analyst and the systems analyst or developer. We were relying on them to do an appropriate interpretation, and then for somebody to check and make sure that that interpretation was the correct way to implement things. So we had a big kind of gap in the middle there that maybe was filled with some human knowledge and maybe wasn't filled with human knowledge. So we often had a disconnect between what was happening on the business side and what was happening on the development side. And we didn't have that business IT alignment. I noticed that Jakob used the German phrase business IT alignment, which I thought was kind of funny. But I realize there's some things that just don't translate as well into some languages. So what we ended up with then is these very lengthy cycles. And this is what model-driven development was really intended to resolve, is these two problems. One is to give us better alignment, so that what was developed in a model, what was drawn in a model by a business analyst, would actually be what was implemented, what was executed in some way. And then also to cut down on the length of the development cycle, because we didn't have this long requirement writing processor as much now, because the business analyst could actually draw what they wanted. It's like, oh, we need the process to do this. And drawing a process that goes from point A to point B is actually usually a little bit faster than writing a long text description of how that process goes from point A to point B. So these are the things that we wanted to address as we got into model-driven development. So here's the dream then, right? Model-driven development. You guys have seen this. You've seen I'm sure the vendors talk about this. So the business analyst now creates these executable BPMN models. This is great. They get in there, they get in the modeler, they draw this stuff. It's all completely executable. They generate their own user interfaces. They test everything. They deploy it out. Everything's happy, and the developer doesn't have anything to do. It's like, hey, what do we need developers for anymore? Now, this isn't actually the reality in many cases, or in most cases, but this is the kind of dream of model-driven development that many vendors are trying to propagate in the marketplace. And although there are some use cases where this works, as I was saying, in the sort of the core enterprise applications, these are the complex applications that you have that form the core of your business, this is typically not something that you can do. Because, well, for a variety of reasons, but they just get too complex in there. So we'll look at some of those reasons and what the problem is. So we do have, as I said, there are some actual use cases for zero-code BPM. And I do see this, and these are the ones that when you have a vendor who's trying to sell zero-code BPM, these are the ones that they're going to use as a demo scenario, because these are the ones that actually kind of fit. So you have these non-integrated things, for example. You have human-centric type applications, somebody doing an expense report, or different types of applications you might have in your office. Probably not your core business applications, not integrated with other systems. The problem with that is although it's nice to be able to have a tool that would allow somebody on the business side to create their own workflows for some of these administrative things, and there's certainly a room for tools like that, nobody is going to make their business more competitive based on having a better expense report workflow. So although these things are important for running the business, they're not critical to competitive differentiation or to the overall success of a business from that standpoint. So that is one of the use cases. The second use case that I have here, and this is coming out more with what the Forrester research is calling smart process applications, which are pre-built applications that are based on typically a combination of process management, content management, rules, case management, a number of different capabilities, and they'll be specifically built for vertical markets. So there might be an application for a process-based application for claims management in a certain type of insurance, so maybe property insurance. And you can now have these pre-built process applications that just require some lightweight configuration. So sort of think of it as like table-driven configuration of an application that's already built. So that's another sort of case, or another sort of instance of zero-code capabilities, although you're not really looking at full BPM capabilities there. You're really looking at just configuring, lightweight configuration of an application. So quite different use cases, but we are seeing both of those in the marketplace. So let's look at the reality then. I have to keep an eye on the time because otherwise I'll still be up here at like noon talking away about this stuff. I get a little excited about it sometimes. So the reality is that we, instead of this dream where the business analyst did everything and deployed their own applications and the developer went on vacation, the reality that I see with my enterprise customers is that we have a business analyst. They might use the BPMS, a modeling tool from within the BPMS suite, but more likely they're using something like Word and Visio and so on to create requirements. They're creating process models, often not complete process models, but ones that represent what we call the happy path, so the straight through path, and then some of the exception cases. But they're not considering all of the technical capabilities that might have to be in there, things like events that might be both emitted by and consumed by the process, and other kind of integration steps and so on within the process. And then they might do some initial forms-based user interfaces, often in the context of these are the data fields that a user would need to have at that point in order to be able to do the work that they're being asked to do at that task. So it'll be some simple UIs and a high-level process that could be executable, except it's missing a bunch of the sort of technical pieces. And then what happens is they pass this off, so they've done their job, and then in reality, they don't really look at that process model again. And the reason they don't look at the process model is we have this idea of a shared model between business and IT. So the developer takes that process model and they add in all of the technical augmentation that's required in order to make that a truly executable process. So they're adding in, for those of you who spend your days like I do with a BPMN 2.0 chart on the wall beside your desk, those 50 different types of event activities in there, they add in a bunch of those, and then they'll probably rearrange how things look in the process model because it's not done in the most efficient way. And at the end of it, if the business analyst looks at the model, they wouldn't even recognize it. It would be like, well, that wasn't the model I created. And they might not be able to follow through it all that easily because there's all of this additional information in there. So in other words, what's happened is that the process model has gone from being a descriptive thing created by, a descriptive artifact created by the business analyst to an actual piece of code. It's just visual code, but it's still code. And you still need to be a developer in order to make it work, because there's a lot of complexity in things like event handlers and so on. And as you get into integration code that might have to be written to other systems as well, this starts to become much more complex, and certainly more complex than your average non-technical business analyst can handle. So although the dream is there that they're going to hand over this model and that the developer is just going to tweak a few things on the model, and then if there's any changes required in the future, the business analyst is going to change that model again, that almost never happens, that I see in any sort of core business application that's created. So the other things, the developer is going to take that model, fix it up, they're going to do all the integration code that has to be done, they're probably going to integrate this into an existing UI of some sort, so into an existing portal framework, or if they've already created some UIs for applications, putting that sort of thing in. Definitely things that you're not going to be able to do as a business analyst. So when it comes down to it, the business analyst could create the basic process flow, or their understanding of the basic process flow. they could probably create some basic user interfaces, and they could test the flow of the process. But what actually gets executed is not going to be the same process model that they create. It's going to be a modified version of that, either a little bit modified or highly modified, depending on all of the things that happen, below the waterline. So, in other words, what happens, and this is really important, and as I was putting these slides together this past week, I was kind of going over and trying to pull out the key ideas here, and the problem that we have is that when you're doing complex enterprise application development, so you're building a process application that's at the core of your enterprise, and this is not, your expense report application. When you use a model-driven BPM system, it's not really all that different from using the non-model-driven one. So if you think about that pre-model-driven development scenario that I talked about, where the business analyst writes some requirements and throws them over the wall to IT, that same sort of thing is happening. It's just happening in a BPM environment, a BPM system now instead. So the application development environment has changed, but that paradigm or that usage pattern is the same as to how business and IT interact with these things and the types of things that get developed. And in fact, what I see, and this is so frustrating because I will go in and talk to customers about how they can now become much more agile if they are using model-driven development and the capabilities that they can have if they use it in the way that it's meant to be used. But instead, they will take these tools and they will use them as if they were traditional application development tools in a waterfall software development lifecycle. So they actually discourage the business analyst from being involved after that initial requirement stage. And I think that that's not at all how we want these systems to behave, whether it's model-driven or as we get into more of the model and code paradigm as what you see in systems like Camunda. It's just we don't want to have that separation. We need to keep those together so that there is some alignment in there. But we have problems with this in many cases because of the culture of how development happens in those organizations. So some of it is the tools, but some of it is the corporate culture as well. So it's the idea, the dream that the vendors provide is this is zero code BPM, and if it's just done right, then it will be like that dream vision I had on the earlier slide, is that the analysts will just build the models, everything will be fine, and the developers only need to get involved if you have some complex piece of thing that they need to kind of add on underneath there. And so, if you look at, well, why aren't they using it correctly in the terms of how the vendor thinks that it should be used? And part of it is that the design tools, even though they're graphical, are still complex, or they're still complicated. So there's a lot of moving pieces in there. There's a very complex language. BPMN is a complex language. And also the logic for how processes work is something where you need to have probably some amount of analytical training or experience to understand how to put together even a process model, never mind the rest of it, but just the process model part of it. So it's not so simple to just say, give somebody a graphical tool and they can create their own processes. Well, they might create a process, but it's probably not the right process. So we have a complexity issue there in terms of what business analysts are trained to do and have the experience to do and what they're being asked to do with these tools. So, when you get into things like event-driven processes, when you get into some of the complex technical activities like integration, when you get into really complex user experience things, they're not going to be able to do that because they don't have the experience of doing that and they don't have the training for how to do that. So these tools are graphical but complicated. So then if we look at why don't the developers use it the way it's supposed to be used? Because now I see its developers will take a large BPM system, one of these big ones that like what Jacob was talking about before, and they're meant to be done complete in this model-driven development, and they'll say, oh no, we're just going to write some processes over there, and we're going to expose them as a web service, and then we're going to write our other code over here the way we've always written it, and then we're just going to call the BPM system when we need it, like as if it's some functional toolkit that's down there. So they don't want to use the BPM system as their core application development environment, or they're not able to because they have a lot of existing code, a lot of existing applications that just can't realistically be replaced. And if you were to say, well, they do have to be replaced, what you're going to find out is that a BPM system as an application development environment is not a very efficient application development environment. So if you're used to working in a Java environment now, you know that you can very efficiently create code in that environment. If you're trying to do the same sort of general purpose computing in a BPM system, which is kind of a special purpose thing, you can't do the same sorts of things. And so you find yourselves having to write a lot of external code anyway, and then attaching it on, and you get these weird hybrid things that are combined between the two of them. The other issue that we have is that there's no support for your corporate application development standards. So if you do have standards about version control and testing and a lot of other tools that you have around your whole software development lifecycle, you might not be able to use those if you're actually developing applications in one of these monolithic BPM systems. So that can be a problem for looking at how you maintain the integrity of your code. Some of the systems are now, the BPM systems are starting to get things like being able to do some versioning of processes, but you won't have the same sort of capabilities. And if you look at a version control system now on a code base, you can do a diff between things and you can kind of see where the changes happen and so on. In many cases, you can't do the same sort of thing with a BPM environment, because it'll just be like, oh, well, you had version 2 and now you have version 3, but we can't really tell you anything about what the difference was between version 2 and version 3. You would have to look at both of them and decide that for yourself. And that's not a very good answer when you're trying to look at what changed from one version to another. So you want to have that support for the application development environment that's usable in your own company now, and to have all of those tools available to you. And that's a lot of the reasons why the developers just aren't taking on this whole idea of a BPM system as a monolithic application development environment. And this one came up, as I was mentioning, a lot of these ideas came out at this BPM Next conference in Monterey this past March. And Scott Francis, who's it's a partner in a company called BP3, and they do add-ons both for, they do consulting, but then they also do some add-on products, primarily for the IBM BPM product, but now also for activity as well, because they're the activity partner in North America. But anyway, so they range between like the commercial stuff and the open source stuff, and they have an understanding of that. And Scott wrote this in his blog after hearing all of these discussions at BPM Next and a number of the discussions that went on online. And this is exactly the point, is that if your application is complex, the application that you have to develop is complex, which means it's probably your core enterprise functionality, then just because you're writing in what's called a zero-code design environment, it's just as complicated as writing code. And so your standard non-coder, your non-technical business analyst, isn't going to be able to do it, isn't going to be able to create a complete application, because it's just a complicated environment. It is a coding environment, it's just that parts of it happen to be graphical, but you're still dealing with a coding environment. And I think this is really the core problem that we have with zero-code BPM systems. Unless you're doing your expense report workflow. So now we look at the alternatives, and this is where things like Camunda come into play, is that we have a less code BPM. It's not zero code, because the idea is that we're adding BPM capabilities to our code rather than rewriting our code in a BPM system, but we are taking advantage of process modeling and being able to have executable models. So we're going to do some modeling and we're going to do some coding, as opposed to saying, oh, everything can be done in a graphical modeling environment. So we still have the idea of executable process models. We'll have some shared models between business and the developer side, which will be the sort of the business level logic. But we'll also find that the developers can use the process modeler to create technical processes, so orchestration, for example, between systems, things that the users don't necessarily think about or don't even know about that's happening in there. It's just that we now have a good tool to be able to do things like orchestration in that environment without having to write the explicit code to do that. So there's some things that are really enabled well by a BPM set of tooling to be able to do that. And the idea, as I said, is that we're now taking our existing applications and we're adding in some process management. And in part, what we might be doing is taking some portions of our code that had process capabilities kind of inherent in the code, and we're just externalizing the process a little bit to the model. So it gives us a greater capability for being able to change that model as we want to, and also provides some capabilities around things like monitoring and monitoring of the processes and that type of thing. So a lot of advantages to kind of adding in that level of model together with process modeling together with our code, without having to say, well, we're going with this complete model-driven development where you have to do your process model and your UI framework and your rules and your integration and everything within the BPM system using what are probably not best-of-breed tools. So this lets you work in your existing environment, best-of-breed tools where the BPM capabilities are just one of those best-of-breed things that you bring into this environment. So what we find then is now much more flexibility around things like embracing our corporate development standards. So if we have version control, if we have code repositories, if we're using certain frameworks, if we have an existing user experience framework, for example, that we need to connect into, if we're, depending on what coding languages we might be dealing with, all of these types of things can now be taken advantage of because we're not changing our core application development environment. Because we still have the same environment that we've been working with, whether it's Java or whatever it might be, but we've now just added on some of these capabilities. We've externalized a bit of the process so that we have better control over that process and more agility over that process, and also to make that process more visible to some of the business side. And you think about the things that you, when you are designing and developing applications, the things that you most often deal with the business on in terms of the requirements are going to be what's the process and what's the user interface. So as long as you have the ability to sort of easily share those things with your business analysts and your business users that might be reviewing this, then I think that you don't need to have a full model-driven development environment because they're never going to look at a number of those other portions of things. So forcing a developer into a non-efficient development environment because we're calling this model-driven and zero code is really not necessarily a good way to go for many organizations. So we end up then, if we look at just the BPM side or just the process side, we now end up with much lighter weight set of tooling. We have a process engine which is added, but it's taking on some of the capabilities that might have been in code before, and it also provides as I said, the externalization of the process model, but also more visibility from a monitoring and managing aspect within there. And we end up with a lot less vendor lock-in. Because now, instead of having our entire application written in a vendor's proprietary environment, which is what you'll have if you write a process application in one of the large BPM vendor environments, now we've written our application in the language that we're comfortable with, in whether those are open standards or whatever they are, and then we've added the process capabilities on. If we decide that we don't like that process management vendor, pulling out the process engine and the process code is much less of a problem than it would be if we had to rewrite the entire application because it was written in their environment. So we see a number of advantages here in working with more of this like code plus model or developer-friendly BPM than what we have with a full BPM system. There's still, we still see capabilities for both. We still see sort of use cases for both, and it's kind of understanding which side you need to be looking at. And in many large organizations, you don't have just one BPM system. So you might have a developer-friendly BPM system that you're using for adding process management to your core capabilities. You might have one of the more user-friendly, model-driven ones that's used for doing administrative processes in your office, like your expense reports or vacation approvals or whatever it might be. So there's different kinds of capabilities, and you don't have to have just one for your entire organization, especially if you're a large organization. So it's really a matter of picking the right BPM for the job that you have. So if we look at the model-driven BPM, and some of the advantages that we see there is that so you need to have the entire executable flow understood by the business. If you're really going to take advantage of model-driven BPM in the way that the vendors tell you it can be done with zero code, then you're really looking at having somebody who's maybe non-technical or semi-technical doing the implementation. So they have to understand fully the executable business process, which means you're probably not doing a lot of complex integration. You're probably not doing any integration with other user interfaces, for example. You don't have a lot of different event logic. It's messages back and forth between processes and so on. But there's a lot of applications for that in our businesses today. There's a lot of straightforward, fairly simple applications that are more around human-centric with a little bit of lightweight integration that could be done by somebody who doesn't have to be a full-on developer. It's these situational applications. If you think about what this is replacing then, the model driven for these lightweight situational applications, is this replacing all the things that business analysts in companies all over the world are doing now with Excel spreadsheets. So, they would build an Excel spreadsheet that has all these complex macros in it, so it'll do this little job that they need to do, because they can't get the attention of IT to build this thing for them as an application, and they want to have more control over it. That's exactly the sweet spot for these model-driven BPM systems, is they can write their own little applications, and there's other tools that can be used in here as well, but they can write their own little applications for doing, some task management, do a little bit of flow back and forth between people, and that can work out really well for them, and it replace a lot of those, things like the spreadsheets, or back in the old days, the access databases and that sort of thing that we see in many organizations. And the term that's often used for these types of things is end-user computing. In other words, it's the business themselves that are creating the applications. IT doesn't support them. IT has no involvement in developing them at all. So that's certainly one great sort of paradigm for how we're using model-driven BPM in the sort of lightweight process application senses. Or you make that decision to use the BPMS as your complete application development environment for your corporation. So if you're going to build on one of these large BPM systems, then you say, well, our core applications are going to be built completely in that environment. And unless you're doing a fresh start for some reason, or you're a brand new business, that's probably going to be a hard thing to do, because you now have all of this existing code, to say we're going to completely rewrite it in this new environment, and there's a fair amount of risk involved there, because you are working in an environment that is proprietary to that vendor. So you need to have issues about training developers, getting the right people to work in that sort of thing, and some of these environments can be very complex when you start coding complex applications in them. So you need to have very specialized skills in order to do that. So less available skills, lots of kind of issues around that. If we look at the other side then, if we look at the model plus code BPM paradigm, in that case we're looking at complex applications. So you're building a complex application that isn't just about process. So process is definitely part of it, but it's not the only part of it. It's not it might not even be the core of it in many cases. You might have things like event-driven processes. So they're very complex logic that you're not going to have somebody on the business side really create that application for you. You could have a situation, as I was saying, where you already have a strong commitment to an application development environment in your organization, because you have a lot of existing code, or you have the team built up to be able to do that type of thing. Everybody's all skilled up and everything. So you really want to be able to take advantage of the BPM modeling capabilities for what the process models give you, but you don't want to throw away all of the stuff that you have and rebuild it in a proprietary environment. So that's kind of more of the scenario for the model plus code BPM, where we're able to use this directly with applications that we've already developed and just pull out some of the capability that would be better served in a process engine. So that's really what we're seeing in the kind of the zero code environment then, is that we have this kind of mythology of zero code BPM, that it's something that is that is the way that BPM is done now, is you just draw these models, these process models, and that creates these executable applications. And that's a very simplistic view of how BPM works. And I think that that's really the problem, is that it will work in simple scenarios. It will work for use cases where, as I'm showing here, where we have things that are completely understood by the business and buildable by the business, because they're similar to the kinds of things that they're doing in their end-user computing environment now. But as we get into our core complex applications, life gets more complicated than that. And so we need to have a tool that fits together with all of the things that we've done in the past in our development environment, not necessarily redevelop everything on a new platform. So just to kind of sum up then, and I think we'll have time for probably a couple of questions. I know we started a bit early because it's Jack handed over to me a bit early, but we can have a few questions or we can go to a break early. I'll be around, I think, in and out most of the day. I might not sit through all of the German presentations, but we'll see how that goes. But just to kind of sum up where we're having the things that I've been talking about here is that model-driven process design, there's no doubt that this provides advantages to us, even if we're working in a more traditional coding environment. The idea that the process model, and I think as I said, the process model and a user interface model or a user interface markup, or mock-up, even a wireframe or something, these are the two things that you use to communicate between business and the development team about what this application needs to do. Is the business is concerned about the process, and they're concerned about the user interface that they need to deal with as they're working through that process. So being able to have model-driven process design really helps us with that alignment. And if they can build, if the business side can build a business process or draw a business process that becomes an executable part of their process, then they have an understanding of it. When they look at the monitoring capabilities on the application side and they see this business process that they drew, they now see that as the framework for their monitoring. They understand, they get how this works in their business environment. So that's really a good way for alignment both at the design time and also at the runtime as we look at monitoring of processes. But we do have these very different BPM paradigms. We have the fully model-driven one, which I said has some really good use cases for end-user computing and relatively straightforward application development by semi-technical or non-technical business analysts. And other than that you really have to look at moving over to a new application development environment. Or we have this model and code BPM that really extends our existing application development environment rather than replacing it. And depending on what kinds of applications you're looking at, you can have different choices here. So both of these are valid things. You can have use cases in your organization that are valid for either of these, but it's a matter of understanding where they best get applied. And I think what happens in working with different environments is, probably many of you work for larger companies where you have large vendors who come in and can be quite, they can pressure management about how things should work. And I think that some of this can be, maybe ammunition isn't the right word, but it's just like a justification for why you decide to go with a lighter weight tooling in certain scenarios and why a model-driven approach, a fully model-driven approach works in other scenarios. So hopefully this has provided you with a little bit of sort of the background of how we got to where we are, the different paradigms that we have in BPM development, and just how to select which one works best depending on what's happening in your environment. It's as Jack mentioned, there's a white paper. You can find this on the Camunda website that I developed earlier, which brings together a number of these ideas and gives you a little bit more of a written version of this. So certainly you can go out and find that. But thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much.
Oh, there are
Sandy.
people out there.
Yes. Any questions? We have the microphone there. Don't be shy. Oh, but it's not because of the language. You can.
I have to tweet you guys.
I'm glad to hear that the dreams and realities are worldwide the same, and not a typical German problem, because a lot of things you told us, it's exactly the same I see in our companies. Mm-hmm. So I'm afraid the less zero code is the next big thing, the next flavor of the month.
Well, yes, and I think that is what happens. Yeah. And it's interesting. You get these ideas about the process agility and really the advantages that having that externalized process, even if you're working in a more traditional coding environment. So the use of model-driven process design is really important for agility in our environment, but it doesn't mean it has to take over entirely what we do. And it's funny that one of the best stories I have about model-driven development and process design comes from an implementation that I did in Germany, actually, with a financial company. So this would have been around the late 90s. And I remember we came over to Frankfurt and we talked to them a lot about their business, and they said, oh, well, you know, every day they were processing transactions from paper. And they said, well, every day all of this paper comes in and it gets split up by type of transaction, and then it goes to the supervisor in each of those transaction areas. And the supervisor decides who gets what thing to process. And I said, well, you know, maybe you should consider just having it go to a common queue and people can work from the queue, you know, now that it's all workflow, it's all electronic. And then if they have a problem with something, they can then send it back to the supervisor, and that supervisor can then assign it to someone else or help them with it and send it back to them. And they're like, oh, no, no, no. Has to be done this way because it's always been done that way. Now, this is when I really, you know, got into how the Germans are about their processes, right? So, because things are a little more casual in Canada about our processes. So, the first day, so I'm there the first day of production, because I always love, this is when I was running a systems integration company. I always love being there on the first day of production, because you get to see all the things that go wrong, but then you get to see all the things that go right. So the first day of production, we're there, the scanners are working, all the documents are coming in, everything is working, everything is fine. 10 o'clock in the morning, it's a supervisor's meeting. All business stops, because now the work was being held, the supervisors were assigning all the work, so all the new work that comes in is the supervisors are all off at a meeting. So they come back from their meeting and it's like, you know, how come everybody's just sitting around? And it's like, well, the work, we're waiting for you to assign the work to us. And what happened in reality when they dealt with the paper flow, and this was one of the things, and this is often what happens is when you have business people model, they will think only about the ideal path, the happy path, and they won't think about the exceptions. And what normally happened during the supervisor's meeting is that there would be some senior person on the team who would just go over to the supervisor's desk and pick up the work and just hand it out to people. So in actual fact, the supervisor wasn't really needed. And they came back and they said, oh, well, we really need to change that, back to that idea that you had about how it just goes into one common queue. And I'm like, okay, we can do that. So we changed the process model, and at that time you had to like cycle the server to change the process model. So we changed the process model, cycle the server, and 5 minutes later they were kind of in production with that. And if you'd done that in sort of traditional code, you wouldn't be able to do that. You don't have that kind of agility. So the ability to just say, I want to change the process model, change what steps happen in what order, and this sort of thing is just, I think that that's one of the best examples of how you can do that very quickly, and how you often need to do that, you know, in the first 2 hours of your first production. Is just because people will see the process that they designed, and they'll say, oh yeah, I know I said that's what I wanted, but that's not really how it needs to work. So you want to have that ability to change it really quickly.
Okay, second chance. No?
That it depends on the circumstances. So whether you might want to go into that model-driven BPMS direction or that more developer-friendly BPMS direction. How easy or difficult do you think is it to know it in advance in which direction you should actually go? And how easy or difficult it is then when you find yourself in that situation later on and discover it was the wrong decision?
Well, yes, there's always the problem of making the wrong decision. So my understanding of the question then is that how easy is it to know in advance whether you should go with a fully model-driven development versus this model and code, and then if you go down one path, what happens if you kind of went the wrong way? So I think there are some definite markers for deciding which way to go in terms of the model, fully model-driven or the model plus code. And again, I'll say what I said at the very beginning, is that this is software, and you can kind of do anything with anything. It's just a matter of how easy it is to do that. So there's certainly efficiencies in different ways to do that. So if you have something that's really a business-driven, human-centric workflow that doesn't have a lot of integration capabilities, doesn't have a lot of complex capabilities, the kinds of things that the business users are building themselves now, like either through manual workflows or spreadsheets or some lightweight tools, that is definitely, and of course we're talking about two ends of a spectrum, and there's a lot in between there. So that end of it is definitely something where you go fully model-driven. You don't even want to have IT involved in them having to develop and deploy something like this. This is really about managing their own tasks and workflow and so on. And that's a perfect use case for the fully model-driven end of things. Now, at the other end of it, if you have applications that you're developing now, let's say you have a big Java development team, you're doing applications now, and you want to add some process management capabilities to it, or take the processes that are built into the code and externalize those into the process engine, then that's obviously more for the model and code. The problem is all that area in between, because this is not, there's all this gray area in between. And it really becomes kind of a judgment call, is you need to look at, first of all, which end of the spectrum you're closer to, and then what makes sense in terms of how this is going to develop, and is this going to become part of your critical core functionality or not. Now, I also mentioned that there was a use case for the full model-driven development environment, the full model-driven BPMS as a development environment, if you were starting with like a brand new coding environment. So if you were building process-based applications, you had a brand new development team, you didn't have an existing code base, then you're looking at choosing your application development environment, and definitely you can be looking at a BPMS as something new for this greenfield development environment. And it is really a judgment call, but you have to kind of look at who's going to be doing the development, how much of a software development life cycle do you want to have, versus just having users putting together their own, or business putting together their own capabilities, and how much can you take advantage of what's in these BPM systems. Now, if you do, as you say, go down the wrong path, I think the key thing is to try to recognize that as quickly as possible. It's definitely, there's ways, if you get a long ways down that path, where you can mitigate the effects of this. So for example, let's say you choose the full model-driven BPMS, and then you get a little ways down the path and you decide that, well, you really have all of this existing code base and you just really wanted to have this other paradigm. You can, with most of the model-driven BPMSs, you can expose a lot of the functionality as services. So now you can just treat it as almost as if it were the process engine and the more lightweight kind of capabilities. You'll only be using a fraction of its capabilities, and so you probably paid too much for it from that standpoint, but it's still possible to use it that way in that same paradigm. And that's, in fact, what I see in some scenarios where an organization will get the full model-driven BPMS, and they might use the full capabilities for some of their applications, but in many of their core enterprise applications, they're just treating it as a set of process services and a process engine to call. So that kind of decision is, you can mitigate that, but there is definitely a cost involved. If you go the other way, if you decide that you want to go more of the model and code, and then you realize that this is slowing you down because these are mostly business-led and business-developed applications, and you don't want to have to go back to the development team every time, well, then you always have the option to bring in a lighter weight model-driven development environment to kind of do that after the fact. So it's, you would have to redevelop things, but it would probably be a relatively fast redevelopment to start to get those productive. So there's ways around it, but it's going to be a little bit painful either way.
Okay. Yep.
Microphone. Okay. My question is to you as a consultant, an experienced consultant. Most of your examples, and also Jacob mentioned that your customers are financial institutions or financial enterprises. I have some experience working in public organizations and a little bit consultancy in public organizations, and what I experience is, yes, they want to look at their processes, they want to model them as a kind of pictures, but to going forward in a kind of automatization of processes, there is a big unwillingness. And my question to you is, what is your experience? Do you know, or have you experience in consulting public organizations, and do they go that way?
Well, I don't think that that's unique to public sector organizations. There's much more process modeling going on than process automation. And it's one of the first BPM conferences I ever attended as kind of an independent was one that was, the company is Provision. They were then bought by Metastorm, which has since been bought by OpenText. So that was like 3 companies ago. But they were a modeling company. They're kind of like Eris. And so I went to their conference, and at they keynote a couple hundred people about the size, and the speaker gets up and he says, oh, well, how many of you are using this to write process models? And everybody puts their hand up. And he said, how many of you are automating those process models? And I look around expecting to see half the audience, 2 people put their hand up. And I'm sitting there, and this was like a revelation for me because I'm coming out of the process automation side, and I'm thinking, well, of course everybody automates their processes, but not actually true. So there are many organizations that are modeling processes for reasons other than automation. They do it in some cases just to document their procedures. So they want to be able to model it so that everybody has a shared understanding of what's happening in there. In some cases, they're using it for process improvement, but in a manual sense, because often when you document these procedures, then by drawing out the processes, you then say, oh, why are we doing that? And then you kind of think about it and you can adjust your manual procedures. So I think that not necessarily with public sector, but in many organizations, there's a lot of modeling going on that we never see because if we're coming at it from the process automation side. I do see in public sector, though, that depending on what the government is and how much money it has, and I'm sure like the government of Dubai or something has more money than the government of Ontario in Canada, but it's there is certainly a reluctance to spend money on things, and so many of the large model-driven development environments, which are can be quite expensive environments to buy, are just outside of their price range. So they might start with doing some modeling, but they might find it difficult to take to the next stage because either they have to look at buying one of these very expensive model-driven development systems, or they need to skill up a team who can do the model and code type, who can do the coding side of things. So there's definitely challenges in getting from just modeling to automation.
Peter.
Okay, one more question and then...
Peter Rösch. What is your experience in using BPM systems running together with standard software like Oracle Financials, SAP, Dynamics? Do the vendors accept that you want to use independent BPM systems?
Well, I think there's a lot of controversy over that with the large software vendors, and this is probably why the large software vendors end up writing or acquiring their own BPM capabilities. So you look at SAP, for example, and they develop their own, what was called NetWeaver BPM. It's now, they have another name around it, but anyway, they develop their own BPM capabilities because they see that the processes inside their system, so the processes that are embedded within SAP R3 or inside Oracle Financials, are very opaque. Like you can't see what's going on, you don't really know what the process looks like, and many organizations want to pull that out so they can see the process, but also they want to really treat that system as a set of services rather than as a monolithic system. So we have been seeing for a number of years that the BPM systems will then use the service points into things like SAP and just treat it as a set of services to be orchestrated by a BPM system. But now we see those vendors themselves come out with a BPM system that could then be used together with that. And I remember when I first looked at SAP's BPM system, I'm actually going to be at the SAP conference in Las Vegas in a couple of weeks and see some of the new stuff coming out. But when I first looked at their BPM system probably 4 or 5 years ago when they released it, and I said, well, this is definitely, if you're an SAP customer, this is the best BPM system that you could have for working together with your SAP. It's probably not going to break into the market otherwise. Now, since then, they've done a lot of sort of improvements to that and have built a full model-driven development environment. So I think that they can start to compete now more with the model-driven development side of things. And they also have the capabilities to do a very deep interrogation into the processes internal in their own system. So if you're using the SAP's BPM, for example, it can go in and interrogate the R3 system for the process model behind the approval of a purchase order, for example, and pull that out and externalize it, both for modeling purposes and also for monitoring purposes. So there's some advantages to having that kind of close tie in there, that close capability. But I think at the same time, they accept that many organizations are using other BPM systems in order to orchestrate their capabilities, and so that they have to have that service layer available to let them do that.
Okay. So thank you very much, Sandy, I think. Thank you. Very great. Thank you.